Yes, well, as Tom says, very warm welcome to you today. I think the number of people here for the very first time, particular welcome to you. My name is Chris Fishlock, part of the leadership team here. And just for half an hour each week, we close the coffee shop and we try to consider serious questions. Hence our question today, is Christianity credible? Now, many people today, I think it's fair to say, dismiss the Christian faith, dismiss Christianity, assuming that it lacks intellectual coherence, that it's somehow incompatible with scientific discovery and inquiry. I think most people who hold this sort of view are not scientists. They've never seriously examined the claims of the Christian faith, and they've simply assumed that science offers a secure, we might say an unquestionable foundation, a kind of sort of intellectual stronghold, somewhere that they can retreat to. Oh, it's safe. I'll put up my smoke screen. By way of contrast, I want to introduce you to somebody called Dr. Rosalind Picard. She is a scholar, an inventor. She's currently the Grover Herman Professor of Sciences and Technology at MIT. She's incredible in terms of what she's done, founder and director of the Effective Computing Research Group at the MIT Media Lab, and seems to do a lot of things in today's world that are very impressive to do with AI. Anyway, she started her adult life as a scientist and as an atheist, a very committed one by her own admission. And she assumed that Christians and all religious people didn't know their science, and if there was some type of Christian belief involved, that it was because a crutch was needed. Now, she was encouraged in her early scientific career to read the Bible. And she said, because it was a Christian friend, a respected scientist who encouraged me to do this, I did it. But it was against my desire. Now, fascinatingly, as she read it, she found that she began to change her mind. And she realized that her assumptions were being challenged by what she was reading independently. And she didn't like it much. And so she slightly withdrew and decided to start looking at some other religions as well. She talks about going to Hindu temples and to mosques. And she seemed to apply the same rigor as she was applying to the Christian faith. And yet she found she kept getting drawn back, and the Bible increasingly stood out as true. She says Christianity was not at all what she expected. And over some time, she moved from committed atheist to agnostic to theist to Christian. And she found that the claims of Jesus were historically verifiable, not only believable, but credible. And in the end, she found that she had little choice but to embrace the Christian faith that was before her. And she talks then about, in her testimony, which is easily available on the internet if you want to see it on YouTube, she talks then about the huge difference that Christianity made to her life, and especially her work as a scientist. And today, there's just a little snapshot of one scientist, committed atheist, who became a Christian through a very simple, independent method of reading the Bible. And that's the challenge that I'd like to put before you today. Don't take my word for anything today. Take the Bible, read it on its own terms. We've put out a couple of books at the back there. These are two books from the Bible, John and Mark, sometimes referred to as biographies of Jesus. It's a very simple way of starting to get to grips with the core message of the Bible. That's the big challenge today. I think it's interesting to suggest that Christianity is not compatible with the ability to think. It's actually a relatively new idea in terms of world history, certainly a very popular one. Gathered momentum, really, it's thanks to people like Richard Dawkins, professor, probably the world's most famous atheist. He said back in a lecture in 1994, as he was trying to sort of bring the atheistic faith, I would call it, he wouldn't, to bring the atheistic belief into the public domain. He said, of course, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. And Dawkins was joined by a number of enthusiastic sort of co-workers back in the 90s and early noughties, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens. They were referred to as the four horsemen of new atheism. Collectively, they produced lots of lectures and books, blogs and interviews. They convinced many that the Christian faith no longer needs to be regarded, that secularism, atheism was indeed a safe stronghold. More recently, at a recent book launch, the author, also atheist, Dan Brown, said it was only a matter of time before our need for God would diminish and then disappear completely. And we put this on the email as we sent it round to encourage you to come today. Dan Brown said, God can't survive science. And I think that sort of anti-God soundbite, it resonates with many. I've been a minister here in the city for 25 years now, and over the years, so many different sort of people love to share their opinion, usually from a sort of I don't know anything about Christian faith starting point. So a journalist said to me once, I studied anthropology at Cambridge, I couldn't possibly believe the Christian view. A city lawyer said to me, but people don't rise from the dead. How do you expect me to take this seriously? And I think such statements are made with great sincerity, but in the end, they contribute to this position, which is increasingly popular. It certainly was a few years ago. Maybe it's true to say it's decreasingly popular, but it's certainly out there, a large proportion of society. I'm intellectually robust. Scientific evaluation gives us the foundation for rational thinking. Conversations about God and Christianity are non-scientific and therefore questionable, doubtful. Hence our question, is Christianity credible? Let me just define what I mean by this question. Is the Christian faith intelligible? Does it make sense to a thinking person? Is it consistent, coherent? Or does it at the end, on sort of close examination, in the end, require us to rely on superstition and embrace the irrational? I think this is a hugely important topic. As I was saying, though, it is a relatively new idea. Go back in time, not so long ago, back to the 16th century, the philosopher Francis Bacon. He's sometimes referred to, of course, as the father of modern science. And he believed and taught that God had given us two books, the book of nature and the Bible. And that rational, thinking people, said Bacon, should study both. Galileo, he was around at a very similar time to Francis Bacon, late 16th century, early 17th century, also often referred to as the father of science. I mean, Galileo gave us the building blocks for astronomy, made numerous advances in our understanding of the observable planetary system. And there was some pressure in his day by the church to accept whatever the church said about the universe. And he fought against this. And he said, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. He pushed very hard in this direction. You see, true Christianity has never and should never discourage the use of intellect and reason to investigate our universe. Galileo, who seemed to have a very genuine Christian faith in the end, he also said, the laws of nature are written by the hand of God in the language of mathematics. It's a lovely way of putting things, isn't it? Kepler, Johannes Kepler, brilliant mathematician, astronomer, 17th century. He said, and I love the way he's captured this, again, committed Christian. He said, all great discoveries are really just a matter of thinking God's thoughts after him. That is a wonderful way of putting scientific discovery, thinking God's thoughts after him. And over the last few hundred years, since these fathers of modern science, our world has been defined and, in a sense, rediscovered by many great philosophers and scientists, all who were Christians. And I could give you such a long list. People like, yes, Bacon, Galileo, Kepler, Faraday and Boyle, we could add Pascal, Kelvin, Clark, Maxwell. It really is a very, very long list. And it would be quite interesting, wouldn't it, looking at all of their discoveries, seeing how they moved from their very intellectual positions, in most cases starting points of atheism that then moved to Christianity. It would be interesting. But actually, even though that would be true, I don't think that's the best way to convince anyone that the Christian faith is true. Just because somebody else was convinced, why should that have any impact on you? And you may be thinking that right now. And in the end, it doesn't come down to brain power that rules somebody in or out of Christianity. It is very simply a willingness to accept factual information. Remember, in the end, faith is based on fact, not fiction. Factual information about the man Jesus. True Christianity must be weighed and measured by a rational assessment of Jesus, somebody that you can get to know, a character from history. And as sure as the birth of Jesus divides our history in two, so the life, death, resurrection of Jesus divides our world in two. And that will include everybody who's here this lunchtime, will be in one of two categories. And so for the rest of our time together, I'm going to suggest that we do something that may be new to you. I mean, if you're just sort of dipping into Christian things, maybe you've been invited along here today, you might not have done this sort of exercise before. But I'm going to suggest that we take the advice that Francis Bacon first gave. He was the father of modern science from the 16th century. And that we apply our skills of rational thought to the message of the Christian faith. Let's analyze it, as he encouraged all good thinkers to do. I'm going to ask you to consider in just a moment a statement of the Christian faith written by the Apostle Paul. And it was written by the Apostle Paul to a group of Christians. Now, Paul, the writer, he's an interesting character. He was a lawyer back in his day. And I guess if there'd been a magic circle law firm in Jerusalem at this time in the first century, he would have run it. He was that sort of character. And actually, again, like some of the characters I've already mentioned in terms of their scientific endeavor, starting off as atheists, Paul, not an atheist, very, very religious, but not a Christian. He was a committed Jew, and he actually hated Christians. He hated Christians so much that he committed many of them to death. And he stood by and watched as whole families were murdered, until amazingly, one day he became a Christian. The very people he despised, he went and became one. We catch up with him in AD 56. You'll see a little statement I've put on the handouts there, at the top of the handouts. He was writing to a group of Christians in a church in Corinth. Corinth, by the way, was a melting pot of ideas, lots of highbrow thinking. All the best sort of scientists and philosophers would have found themselves in places like Corinth, certainly for most of their career if they weren't in Rome. And so there was a lot of sort of academic prestige in a place like Corinth. And he wrote this. This is in a book called 1 Corinthians. He wrote, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God." And so what I want to do this lunchtime is convince you that authentic Christian belief comes down to a personal decision. And that's something that, to a certain extent, you are in charge of, a personal decision about the message of Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. And so our method, as I've already sort of slightly outlined, very simple. Take this verse that I've just read and sort of dissect it a little bit. Let's apply some rational thinking and reason to this sentence. I'm going to throw out a few ideas under three headings that I put on the rest of your handout there: a message, a decision, and a future. We'll start with the message. You see, the message is very simple. We're told in that verse, aren't we, that it's the word of the cross. An honest assessment of the Christian faith must come down to the words written about the absolute core event of the Christian faith, which is the cross. The word of the cross. It's a statement, very simply, that we can sort of organize the whole of Christian thinking underneath. It's the life and work of Jesus. And so in a sense, the message of the cross, because that's the absolute apex of what we believe, it includes everything that we believe. We could say it includes the whole Bible. A very book that that lady that I was telling you about at the beginning of our time together, Professor Picard, was encouraged to read, changed her from atheism to Christianity. Now, the Bible is actually 66 books. All 66 books written over about 1,500 years on 3 different continents by about 40 different authors. They're actually all about one person, which is an incredible sort of feat in and of itself. They're all about Jesus. The Old Testament, that's the first 39 books, they're preparing the way for the coming of Jesus, the Old Testament. The New Testament, that's the next 27 books. Jesus has arrived. He's here. What does that mean? What does that look like? What does he come here to do? So the word of the cross is longhand for the whole Bible. Can we come up with a shorthand, an executive summary? How do we sum up the whole Bible? Well, I think if Paul was here, he'd very quickly sort of pitch up and say, well, yeah, I think I wrote one in that same letter. Why don't you flick forward a few pages? And I've written it there, chapter 15. You don't need to flick forward. We didn't put out any Bibles today. We thought it'd be easier just to cut and paste. So you see there, verse 3 to 6, chapter 15. Here's a sort of an executive summary of the whole Bible, in a sense. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500. This is the earliest recorded statement of the Christian faith, as far as we're aware, that anyone has record of. One of the leading New Testament scholars, ancient historians of our day, is a guy called Gerd Ludman. I'm sorry if I've totally butchered that name if you're German here today, Gerd Ludman. And he says these words are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. That's an incredible thing to say. And it's particularly incredible coming from this German guy, Gerd Ludman, because he is a well-known and published atheist. But because he's an ancient historian, he takes documents very seriously. And he says this statement, from its historical reliability, can be dated within 2 years of the crucifixion. That's an incredible statement. Take it up with the atheist Lundman if you don't agree with that. That is fascinating. That means within 2 years of this guy's, of Jesus' death, the fact that Jesus had been raised was so widespread, so common, that this sort of creedal statement was being circulated, the word of the cross. I mean, if you're a rational person, if you're a thinking person, it's upon these words, essentially about the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, that your assessment of the Christian faith and of what it might mean for you, it must rest on that. And we'll come back to that shortly. For now, though, I want to see that the message, the word of the cross, it always gets a mixed reaction, and that brings us to the second point, a decision. It's a bit of a sort of Marmite reaction. Some love it, some hate it, but the choice is always binary, folly or power. You see, the cross was an instrument of torture. It was designed very carefully to kill people, but not quickly. Okay, that's in sort of the opposite of the guillotine. The guillotine was sort of there to sort of quickly end somebody's life. The cross was there to prolong death and make it agonizing. And it was synonymous with shame. I mean, it was invented by the Romans, but there was a sort of an announcement during the invention of the cross that no Roman citizen should ever have to be punished with the cross. It was reserved for the worst and the vile offenders. And so it was apparently the opposite to anything macho or heroic. You think about some of the sort of poetry that we sometimes refer to around the First World Wars and the sort of glory of giving your life for king and country and that sort of thing. Sort of dulce et decorum-esque stuff. Well, the cross was the opposite of all of that. The word folly, this word in the text, in the original language, in the Greek, it's moria. It's where we get the word moron from, moronic. It's like people saying, look, the cross is a moronic thing to believe. How could a long-promised king, you want me to take this king seriously? He went to a moronic death. So obviously synonymous with shame. So, when it comes to my life, how on earth am I meant to take that sort of thing seriously? I mean, why would the God who made this world, after thousands of years of preparation, the first 39 books of the Bible, we've been waiting for this guy Jesus to arrive. Why, when he finally arrives, would he send him to such an anti-hero death? Well, this really gets to the heart now of what we need to consider. Because the message is crafted to disarm any who would look at it. That includes you. The inherent weakness of the cross, because it does look so pathetic, the inherent weakness is the way that God, who made this world, has decided to display his power. You see, if you're somebody who is prepared to accept that there is a God who has power to create things like the world in which we live, the body in which you breathe, then let me urge you to think again about the cross, maybe for the first time, maybe afresh. You see, this rather despised method of torture and death is the way that God starts to display his power by disarming our natural thinking. We assume there cannot be anything of any credibility tied up with something of such shame, and God says, that's where I'm going to put my power. It forces us to come off our high horses. It forces us to stop saying, I know best. It forces us to start saying, maybe there is a God who has another plan. Remember the creedal statement. It's there again, just above the point we're on. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. You see, in the end, sin is very simply pushing God out of our life. We often think of sin in terms of sort of the bad things that we do, but actually the bad things we do, bad things we think, that's just merely a symptom. The root cause, living in God's world without reference to him. Christ died for our sins. He died in the end because we live naturally without reference to him. And yeah, sure, that shows itself in all sorts of less than great things that we end up doing. But the root cause, living in God's world without reference to him, even in polite giving to charity sort of ways. Sometimes that may be atheistic, agnostic, or just apathetic. Just never got round to it. There may be something to Christian faith, but I never thought about it myself. Essentially, sin is the proud stance which says, when it comes to life, when it comes to my life, I'm in charge. You can't tell me what to believe. You can't tell me what to do. And God says, look at all my power focused on the cross. It's so brilliant because that symbol of torture and shame deals with the exact thing that I begin to realize I deserved for pushing God out of my life. I mean, what an incredible thing for God to do. So kind, so gracious that he decided to give the consequence of my actions to somebody else, to his son. You see, on the cross, my sin was given to Jesus. He suffered and died on the cross. He didn't do anything wrong. He was the only person that lived a perfect life in God's sight as God's son. And he died. He took my sin and he took it to the grave. And then he rose from the dead. That's why the resurrection is absolutely critical. He rose from the dead to prove that the sacrifice had been successful. Great minds can sometimes miss it. The amazing thing is, tiny children can sometimes get it. That's how brilliant this is. You don't need to be some great sort of Galileo-type intellect. And sometimes, actually, a great intellect can almost sort of end up overthinking. Well, I wonder what you make of all that. In the end, it takes humility. It takes the getting off our natural starting point. We're all in the same position. We're on a high horse. We need to get off it and just consider for a moment. It takes humility to admit you have sin. It takes even more humility to accept that someone else and not you needs to pay for it because you can't. The message of Christianity stands against human pride. Pride naturally says, in slightly different ways to every one of us, we don't need God. We'll be fine by ourselves. And the cross proves that we do need God. And if we're prepared to think, just for a moment or two, well, we might see a different perspective to this message. Not folly, but power. And that leads us, thirdly, as we sort of draw to a close, to see why it matters. Because there is a future at stake. This is not just a sort of momentary little bit of intellectual stimulation. All of eternity and all of the future is at stake, and you'll see that there. I've tried to capture that in the third point, perishing or saved. Two groups of people are identified. Just look back at our core verse. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Two groups of people, those who are perishing. That means in the process of slipping away. Not slipped yet, but in the process of slipping away, like going down a sort of long slide, slipping away to ruin. And then there's the other group, us who are being saved. It means those who've begun to grasp the Christian faith, increasingly take the Christian faith seriously, realize that Jesus is a character who can be trusted, realize that Jesus did die personally for you. And those people, well, they're on the way to heaven. What's interesting, though, about both of those groups of people, it's a state not fully realized yet. For those perishing, there is worse to come. It's a warning. For those being saved, there is better to come. Certainty now, heaven is to come. So, is Christianity credible? Well, I hope this lunchtime you can see that it doesn't come down to IQ. In the end, extra IQ will not help. In God's infinite wisdom, he has decided to use this message about Jesus' death on the cross to split our world into two. So let me urge you to consider those words carefully again. Let's read that creedal statement one more time. You'll see it there, a third of the way down. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500. Well, there's some things to think about. And the challenge, I told you the challenge was very simple at the beginning. We loved having you here today. Thank you if you've been brought along. Take take it as a gift, one of these Gospels. A gospel is just what we referred to as one of these books of the New Testament. Here's John, here's Mark. John was a friend of Jesus. He knew him personally. He was the only one of the 12 who wasn't actually martyred. The other 12, the other 11, were all martyred for their faith. John was exiled, okay, so he got to die of old age on an island, sort of island we might go to on holidays, but back in those days it was terrible. Patmos, I think, was the place. He died in exile there. That's John. Mark, he was the scribe of Peter, also a close friend of Jesus. You'll actually get to know Jesus if you read these books. Take one away as a gift from us. Make up your own mind. Christianity is credible, but don't take my word for it. You decide yourself.